Hi, Jessica.
Hi, Zach. How are you?
I'm pretty good. I see you kind of looking at some of the native plants around the library.
Yeah, it's looking like a really good planting, really good native planting.
I'm glad you think so. Happy summer.
Thanks. Happy summer to you as well. I'm Jessica Merkling. I'm the North Region Urban Wildlife Biologist for the Division of Fish and Wildlife within the Department of Natural Resources.
So what does that kind of mean for our younger audience?
Yeah, it's quite a mouthful. So the Department of Natural Resources, often abbreviated DNR, is the group for Indiana that's responsible for preserving, protecting, and using responsibly those cultural, natural, and recreational resources we have within the state of Indiana. The Division of Fish and Wildlife, our role within the DNR is to specifically look at the fish and wildlife and their habits. And then being the urban wildlife biologist, I focus a lot on the areas of Fort Wayne, South Bend, and Elkhart within city limits usually. And I talk about living with wildlife, planting native habitat like you guys have here for pollinators and other wildlife, and education and outreach.
Awesome. Well, maybe we can do a little bit of that out here. So we obviously put in a lot of native landscaping here at the library, and you talked about, and this is obviously within a city.
Absolutely.
You talked about urban biology. Could you talk a little bit about what that is? Like, what's the difference between biology, the umbrella, and like what makes something urban biology?
So when we talk about urban biology, we often focus a little bit differently, because what urban biology means is we look at how wildlife interacts with the environment that's influenced by the built environment. So when we have buildings and sidewalks and streets and large numbers of neighborhoods and people, so what happens is when we're building those environments, we often change the environment, and sometimes we create new spaces for wildlife to use, or sometimes we take away spaces for wildlife to use.
But what's the point of making sure that interaction or combination happens in a good way?
So we have to make space for everybody. Obviously, humans have the right to live and do what they need to do, but we want to make sure that we're not doing it in a way that's harmful to what species we have left. What we know right now, not just in Indiana, but statewide, countrywide, internationally, the biggest threat to our the biodiversity of all of our species is habitat loss. And so putting habitat in these urban areas can really help foster homes and places for different wildlife, pollinators, and other species.
So you're saying kind of even if humans are building places like the library or the streets or anything, that we can do intentional things to kind of bring back some of that space?
Absolutely.
What's that kind of look like?
It can be a lot of different things. You can actually get really, really creative with it. So the library chose to plant native plants. A lot of these plants you might have seen traditionally in more of like a wild grassland prairie, where there's a lot of native grasses and plants. But you can actually do native landscaping by putting large pops of color together with native plants instead of using some of the non-native or invasive species of vegetation we typically associate with planting in homes. And additionally, when you look at mown turf grass, obviously humans have a need for it, right? We have to play sports, we have to have picnics, and we have to have walking trails. But in areas where it's not being used, it's just there's not a lot of habitat. There's nothing here that really is good for wildlife to hide or to thrive in. Whereas if you look at those native plants, they have pollen and nectar, which feeds our insects, which is the vast majority of our pollinators, which are anything that helps plants reproduce by transmitting pollen back and forth. So they can be bees, butterflies, moths. In Indiana, it can also be hummingbirds, ants, flies. So those insects are really the base of most of our food chains, and they feed most of all the other wildlife. And 1 in every 3 bites of food we take is usually the result of a native pollinator.
Holy cow. So obviously we put a lot of effort into making this a more expansive park, putting a lot of flowers and things instead of just the lawn. Are there people benefits to making a native landscape versus just having kind of a lawn?
Absolutely. So we often think only of the pollinators or the other species that benefit from planting native, but there's a lot of good human benefits too. So you and I have to drink water, so does the wildlife, right? So if you look at typical turf grass, they have really short roots that are about 3 to 6 inches long, where we have native plants that some of them go up to 16 feet deep. So when you have those really deep roots, you have more surface area. So as the water comes down, it can filter through those roots and recharge our water tables and clean out the things like pollutants and fertilizer and things like that that often get washed into our water. Also, when you plant native, they're adapted to the local conditions. They're adapted to those crazy cold snaps Indiana gets, the native wildlife that likes to munch on them. So if you plant native, they've had time to adapt. So realistically, you're looking at a lot less time in applying pesticides, applying fertilizers, even watering.
What makes something native for people who don't know? Like, what qualifies as native for Indiana?
That's a really good question. So when we think of native, we honestly usually use kind of an arbitrary term, which is essentially 500 years ago or before European settlement.
Yeah.
So something that is native didn't have to be brought here by humans. So it already occurred here naturally. It's kind of confusing because there's a lot of different words that we use to describe things. So there's native, meaning it has been here for at least 500 years. For some species, we use the term naturalized or non-native, which just means they've been here for a while, but they're not really harming the environment, but they're probably not really helping anybody either. When we talk about invasive species, those actually have to have some type of negative impact as far as the environment or people or monetary part of it. And we talked about how biodiversity, the #1 threat is loss for habitat. The actual #2 threat is spreading invasive species. And if there's a lot of really good resources for people to do this, we have a lot of native seed nurseries and native plant nurseries. The DNR, specifically the Division of Fish and Wildlife, we have different biologists. I mentioned I cover Fort Wayne, South Bend, and Elkhart, but we do have other biologists for the other counties. We also, if we can't cover an area, there are things like your local farm bill biologists. We also have the SWCD, which is Soil and Water Conservation Districts.
Yeah, right.
And a lot of local groups, I think we were talking about Little River Wetlands Project earlier. They do have some plant giveaways. So there's a lot of different resources that people have available.
To be able to get the native landscaping and get the native plants.
Yes, and even specifically for biologists within the Division of Fish and Wildlife, we can help you with management plans and things like that. We even have on our website, we have videos of how to put backyard native habitat in the ground.
Oh,
so we talk
awesome.
about how to properly plant it and get it in there.
Awesome. I heard you're gonna actually give us some stuff to put in our steam boxes for people to pick up and experiment with.
I actually got some native seed packets, which is a really good starter mix of 5 different native species. And I put them inside of a brochure from our Pheasants Forever, Quail Forever chapter that talks about how to plant them to get the best outcome.
Oh, awesome. So people can do this at their own homes.
Absolutely, and if they run out of resources here, you can always go to wildlife.in.gov and find all the resources that I mentioned with the videos and find your biologist and all the other resources.
Well, thanks so much for coming down and hanging out with us in our own space and telling us a little bit about what you do and what we can do.
Absolutely, thank you for planting native.
All right, see you later.
Have a good day.